Well, what's interesting though, it's like even then I was thinking about it just now. It's the while it was really like interesting and distinct. It's like and now it's time for Superbad. Just trying to like create that visual in my head. It was because we're so used to the either like shh, or like a sort of sound effect of when he changes, or like some sort of visual cue of like he's running into a phone booth or something. But it was always really interesting in this whenever he turned into Superman in these episodes, it was just like his voice shifted, and I kept on wondering, like, is he changing in this? Is he not changing? I kind of hope that he doesn't. But like, what is that like? What does that look like? And again, that kind of comes to another sort of sense of how radio and audio drama storytelling has changed. If we were to do that in the Llama, like, where, for example, like we did make sure that our star, Gianmarco Ceresi, that when he has a Jethro Dumont voice and he has a Green Lama voice, he hated doing the Green Lama voice because it really destroyed his voice. And he did a great job of it. But, we had to sort of time that out. Either way, like if we were to do something where he actively changes costume, we would have to do some sort of sound effect to indicate that. We would do something to sort of indicate like there is a transformation, unless it's like, and there are moments in the story where he's like in the shadows out of costume, and we delineate that very clearly, where in this, it's just, I'm Superbad now. And the kids just accept it.
Welcome back to the Men of Steel podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, J. Mike Falson.
Welcome back, everybody. Glad to have you.
I'm glad to be back because we are digging into the radio serials again. It's been a while since the last time we talked about the radio show.
Long time.
And that was stuff from the early days. We're jumping forward a couple of years. And for that conversation, we are joined yet again by Adam Lance Garcia.
Hi, how you doing?
And from the Green Lama, Adam's radio drama project, we are joined by the co-writer, co-creator, Steele Filipek.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciative and glad to be here to talk this stuff.
Yeah, so we had reached out to Adam because we knew that that there was a new round coming out, and it was like, all right, well, what can we talk about now that we haven't already discussed? Because Adam had been on here to talk about Superman 3. He had been on my other show to talk about The Rise of Skywalker. And I was like, hey, what if we did the radio show? That would be a lot of fun and feel like kind of in the right wheelhouse. And if we're going to do that, why don't we do the Superman Batman crossover?
It was a good choice. It was a good choice. I'm really excited by this choice that you've made, sir.
But why don't, since we're talking about the radio show and you guys actually work on a serialized audio drama format, why don't you talk a little bit about the Green Lama and that, give some quick plugs here.
Sure. Well, Steele and I have a radio audio drama production company called Radio Room. We've been working together for Steele, it's been 6 years. It's going to be 6 years.
Oh, it's going to be 6 years this summer. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And we have two series going on: The Green Lama, which is a Buddhist superhero from the 1940s that we are the licensed audio drama producers behind, and Queens of the Sapphire Sea, which is an excellent radio drama series created by Steele. Steele, tell us a little about those two projects.
Yeah, so the Green Lama, is very similar to the topic that we're going to be discussing today. It's a superhero in New York post-war. It's dealing with morality and kind of this nebulous vigilantism that emerges post the end of the Nazi era. Where do superheroes go when they're not, hitting the chin of Hitler in every issue? And it's a lot of fun. It's an action-adventure series. We kind of describe it, a little bit kind of like Batman the Animated Series in terms of tone. Not so serious, a little bit of levity there to it. It's 8 episodes long, about 35 minutes apiece, except for the last one, which is an hour. Thank you very much, Adam. And it's punching, and we have people in masks and crime, and crime families, a gang war. Very classically.
We have 2 vigilantes.
Yes, we have several vigilantes. Classically themed pulp hero stories with a little more realistic. They're obviously there's superpowers and things, but a little more grounded. And Queens of the Sapphire Sea is my own project that Adam has co-produced. That's kind of the aim of Radio Room, that we produce each other's work and help alleviate the burden. And so it's a post-war, interwar France, 1930s, seaplane pirates, 2 seaplane mercenaries, Belle and Madeline Bernassi, and their bounty hunting business. Very, very akin to Porco Rosso, if anybody is a fan of Hayao Miyazaki. We just did the first half of season 2. There are a total of 11 episodes up online if anybody's interested. Swashbuckling, rat-a-tat-tat comedy, guns flying, bullets flying rather, not guns flying. That would be interesting. It's
actually now I want to put that. I now want to put that in an episode.
I think we have to, and so
they're all out of bullets now. They're just tossing the guns at us.
I mean, speaking of Superman, that classic GIF, the classic meme throwing the gun at Superman and having him duck. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot. We just get together, we write, we get to tell our stories. It's essentially like we get to create a television series, but it's all audio, and it's so much driven by dialogue and the times. We wanted to evoke the era without necessarily going back to the production style of the era. I think we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. So it is set in the past, and there are some tropes that are there, but we also kind of wanted to update some of the things and kind of give a more modern storytelling experience.
The biggest thing that we wanted to do with the Green Lama and Queens of Sapphire Sea is, like, how do you make these radio shows that felt like you were sitting down in front of a radio in 1945, you're a kid, and you're listening to these and having these adventures, but doing it in a way that speaks to a modern day audience, which, we would never try to recreate the era because that's difficult, and the line between homage and parody is very thin. So what we did was basically, as Steele mentioned, we tried to do the Batman and the animated series, but also kind of Indiana Jones. This idea of Spielberg and Lucas loved the serials, so they made a movie series that made them feel like they're watching the serials. And that's what we did with Llama and Queens of Sapphire Sea. And it's like, if I could do this full time with Steele, I probably would, because it's the most. And this is me complimenting him, not just because he's there, but my producing and writing partnership with Steele is the most satisfying experience I've had as a professional. It's just, we challenge each other. We don't agree at any point on anything ever, but that makes us better writers and better producers. And that's your spiel.
Yeah. So I finally had a chance to listen to some of the Green Lama, and I have to say, wow, this is exactly my jam. There were moments where I had to be like, wait, is this written explicitly for me? Because there were nice allusions to Doc Savage in there being like, that bronze guy living in the Empire State Building. And I was like, nice, here for this. And like every now and then, like a little bit of a like rah America. But wait, is it really having actually like that good sort of like modern questioning of the post-war era? And like, I actually have a note for us to talk about how the story we're doing today is post-war. And really it's just to be like, oh, it's interesting that they're kind of like struggling to find the voice of this era so immediately after World War II, where it's like, okay, well, now we've lost this like major thing that was just going on in the real world that we couldn't help but talk about, and trying to stay focused on it and have things like advertising that's still kind of focused on it. We're going to talk about Kellogg's Pep. But so specifically what we're talking about today is the Batman Superman crossover. It's not actually their first crossover. The first one was The Mystery of the Wax Bin, which also was on the radio show. But there's only like 2 episodes that were preserved of that one. And like they might find more at some point. But my understanding is that you can't listen to the whole one. So this is their second team up. And I mean, second team up ever. They had not done a comic book crossover yet at this point.
Oh, wow. I did not realize that. That's even more fascinating.
they were appearing in World's Finest together, but they actually had separate stories. It would be them on the cover and then like Superman story and a Batman story, but not actually a team up of them. So this is really early in that, like that voice of the character. And like Batman is here. And he doesn't really need to be, frankly, here. Like, he's useful. Like, you could have also had a cop. You could have had anyone who's like a particularly like astute individual be in this part, because like it's kind of it's the adventures of Superman.
Yeah.
Like, and it's featuring an appearance of Batman and Robin rather than like a true like crossover between the two.
Yeah.
It very much, like Tuxedo Mask, like showing up. My work here is done. Like, but you didn't do anything,
Right.
I was here. I contributed.
Yeah, it was utterly fascinating. Like I already mentioned at the top, but like listening to this was really elucidating for so many reasons, and I'm hesitant to say that I really enjoyed this, but I really enjoyed this, if that makes any sense.
I mean, like, look, there are definitely aspects that don't really hold up just in general because it's a 1945 radio serial. We're definitely gonna have to talk about
how language has evolved.
Fuck it, let's just talk about this. I got really worried when I started listening to like the first chapter in the first disc of the DVD or of the CD collection, because I was like, wait, did I just send them to completely the wrong files? Because it's a serialized story, which means that the episode that starts the story is mostly the finale of the previous arc. And it is involving little people. And the language used for it is pretty free. And I don't think any of it's coming from a place of hate, but wow, did I feel real weird listening to it. And also there's a buried treasure subplot, and it seems kind of just like, wait, did we just have a fantasy story?
Pirates?
And I was like, oh fuck, did I just send them a racist creed instead of like actually the Superman Batman story? And no, it finally switches around at the end of the episode. But it's like 75% other story, and then 25% at the end being like, okay, how do we set up the next thing? And that's just like the nature of those kind of serialized stories, where like you do a 14-part story, but like the last episode sets up the next one, so that like they have to come back for the next chapter. Like, you can't help it.
Yeah, they were churning these things out. We were kind of chatting about this before the show. They were doing it live or almost live with sound effects. It was a soap opera, like every day or, most days, getting that stuff out there is a way to sell Kellogg's. And you wanted people to stick around. You had to have a reason for people to tune in every day. So that the sponsors got what they wanted, and so I too there are some things about it that we can discuss. I appreciated the form. It's hard to imagine now, but Superman as a radio show was so radically popular back then. So many of the things that we associate with Superman, Kryptonite, Jimmy Olsen, certain subplots and points, they come from the radio show. There's a whole interesting history about how Superman took down, quote unquote, the KKK in the radio series. That they worked with the Justice Department to essentially satirize the Ku Klux Klan. Because Superman was so popular, and there's so much around it, and so it's cool to kind of look back and to see, storytelling has evolved, audio drama has evolved, but to see where this kind of came from, it is a time capsule of a sort. And while I don't like everything that happens in these episodes, I do appreciate and see what they were doing, why they were doing it, where it was going. Long now we can look back 76 years, 78 years.
Yeah, and to that point, it's just like even just seeing how people viewed Superman and how they used Batman. I mean, we've already mentioned Batman really kind of he's in the series, but he's not really in the series as we understand Batman. But just seeing how, one thing that I've always loved about Superman and Batman, as almost like from an archaeological standpoint, is seeing how they evolve through time. And this is such an interesting time capsule of, this is not even anywhere near what Batman's going to be. This is nowhere near what Superman's going to be. There's all these choices that if you did in a Superman or in a Batman story today, you'd be crucified for. Just like little choices like having Batman like get shot in the leg and not be able to do anything for an entire episode, or like
well, he did. He was throwing bricks.
Throwing bricks, or like getting stuck in a well and shouting for help, and just like opening a window because I need time to think. And they're just like, okay, but isn't he in a mask? And like he's in the, and he's, but yeah, there's all these little things that you never could do now. But it was just this nascent period of time that you could do these kinds of stories, and that's utterly fascinating.
Yeah, and I think more so for Batman. Like, I think Superman, the broad strokes, Steele, like you said, were established with the radio show. Like Superman working at the Daily Planet for Perry White with Jimmy Olsen. All of those are radio show elements. Even Inspector Henderson, who shows up in this, starts off as a radio show element, becomes the George Reeves TV show, and then doesn't actually make it into the comics until the 70s. Like, so there's a lot of like things that are like now just like parts of the character that like, most of the details here for Superman are not that weird. Like, he's got X-ray vision by this point, which he didn't last time we checked in on the radio show. And they've never been that clear on if he can fly or just jump. You just like the radio show just was like, not touching that one. We're just going to just whiz us through the air.
Yeah.
But Batman was not very popular at this point. You know, like one of the fun things of trivia is just like how much the Adam West show really influenced Batman being well known to pop culture, especially beyond like comic book fans specifically. Like Batman didn't get canceled like a lot of books did, but just because he was good enough to stay afloat during that period doesn't mean that he was the phenomenon that he is now. Like, we were talking before we started recording, like I just saw the Batman last night, and like it was a pretty packed theater that I wasn't thrilled about. And it's a couple weeks after the movie came out, you know, like Batman is a thing. Like Batman is the property of DC that like people associate first now in a way that Superman used to be.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to see that flip, because here, like, he's never Bruce Wayne. At no point is he Bruce Wayne in this entire story. It's so weird.
But doesn't he show up like as Batman? No, yeah, you're right.
He did.
He shows up as Batman. Dick Grayson shows up. Dick Grayson has a secret identity, but effectively Batman is just Batman. There's no other thing. And all the times that Dick slips up, a lot, by the way, he keeps on dropping his identity all the time. Every single time he just says Batman. He never once thinks to say Bruce. Batman may as well have no secret identity.
I mean, that's something that I find interesting, and it's something like 60% of revenue that the DC Comics, generates comes from Batman or Batman-related products. Overwhelmingly, he's the central character, as opposed to kind of the differentiation maybe that Marvel has or Image or anything like that. But this is a time capsule, once again, looking back when this character was a lot smaller. It's kind of like watching The Simpsons in season 1. Back when it was, it was popular, of course, and people really liked it, but it wasn't really until season 2 and season 3 that it really exploded into the public consciousness. And so seeing some of the choices that are being made, and you can see, that this is the character that is now being played by Robert Pattinson, and there are things there, but it also is they're still trying to get their sea legs, and there are a lot of elements of the form of audio drama, of radio drama, that they kind of have to shoehorn in there. All these different kind of weird things in a well, opening a window, trying to evoke the image for the audience. Radio serials had been popular for several years, but obviously, but post-war America, soldiers are coming home, people are looking for entertainment, and they're just churning these things out. And this was kind of like a way, like maybe we can create another character. Maybe we can, this team up is the perfect way to introduce a new character, and let's see where it goes. Because the Batman film serials, they were popular, but not nearly as popular as any of the other adventure serials from the time, Buck Rogers and anything like that. Superman was the heavy hitter. Also, and you can see this in the early comics where the tone of Batman shifts pretty regularly in that first decade. It starts out as kind of a crime noir kind of thing, and then it becomes a little more, like Brave and the Bold, and then it takes another turn. It's all over the place.
Yeah, and I think that Batman's power set, or lack thereof, I should say, explicitly is in opposition to the format for radio stories. Like, a weird epiphany I had was when I realized that, functionally, the Shadow and Superman are the same in a radio serial in terms of how they function narratively, because Superman shows up and you can't hurt him. The Shadow shows up, likewise, you can't hurt him. Sure, there's you could have a trap or you could have something, but you can't see him, so he's effectively invulnerable. So the mystery has to not be just something that the character showing up and directly confronting a villain. like that can't be how you have to solve it. Like that has to be something that they work up towards. Like they have to build the character, build the drama around their civilian identity, having to sort of like find them and get to them, and then they make themselves revealed. And really, the confrontation isn't that difficult once they actually get there. And that works for Superman in much the same way. But Batman doesn't have anything like that. Batman is just the same human.
Yeah, but to that point, though, it's like I don't think it's necessarily an issue of the format of radio drama. I think it's more of a format of like of what was going on at the time within the genre and how people approach these characters. And speaking again from experience, like you can have a vigilante superhero story where in audio drama that has a lot of action, that can have a lot of excitement that you would associate with like a superhero film. But I think back then they just didn't know how to write these characters. They were still learning. There's the idea of, well, we can't tell a story because we can't have like Superman show up until the very end to solve the problem, because then there's no story. We've learned since then that you can actually tell us a really significant story with Superman being a main character. The Batman is a perfect example, who he's in character the entire way through the film, and he is the Batman from beginning to end, and the story still functions. I think just it's more looking back at this time, they're learning what they can do with these kind of superhero characters, because they don't, partially because of the production limitations, partially because they're so new. These characters are 6 years old, so they really don't necessarily know how to tell these stories in this format just yet.
Not just those characters, superheroes as a genre, is in its early format. They're figuring out what to do. They're throwing everything at the wall, and you see the explosion of these characters that have had a pretty centered villain or style for a 4-year period. Where they're selling war bonds and, kicking the tobacco juice out of Nazis, either at home or abroad. And now they're like, okay, so what's next? What are we going to do? And, Superman eventually evolves to become not a science hero exactly, but he lives in Metropolis, kind of post-crisis, Lex Luthor, and he's from this faraway planet, and the House of L, and all this. And none of that's established right here. They're just trying to, they're trying to figure out what this all means. Batman, all this other stuff too. What is a superhero story? What does it mean to tell a superhero story?
So yeah, to that point, it's always so really just interesting to see, like, there was like that whole episode where Clark Kent and Batman ask for help from an Irish cop, and they just kind of walk around in a carnival. Again, it's that sort of nascent, we are learning what to do with this format. And today, to our ears, like, that is just absurd. I'm pretty sure that one of your listeners are like, has to like rewind this to be sure that we heard this correctly, that Clark Kent and Batman in costume go into a carnival with an Irish cop to look for Dick Grayson and Jimmy Olsen. That is a thing that happens in the story. And
it's like 2 episodes.
It's 2 episodes, yeah. And that to our ears is absurd, but back then,
yeah.
Importantly, it's Clark Kent. This is a big part of the. There's Superman, yeah, but it's Clark Kent that is doing a lot of this stuff, and then there's Batman in costume. Yeah.
He just shows up in full costume. He's just like, "Hey, Batman. Hello, Clark."
Shows up as Batman, and it's just like, oh. Like, the cop's like, oh, Faith and Begora, like, I almost took you for that Batman fella. And it's like, what? Why would anyone think that that's the way to approach the situation?
It's funny because it's not just and to sort of that larger point, it's not just the Batman and Superman. Like, the Green Lama had a radio show back in the 1949. And if you ever listen to that, some are available online. Like, Jethro Dumont, the Green Lama, goes into a taxi and he's like, "Oh, you're Jethro Dumont, the Green Lama." And it's just like, doesn't he have like a secret identity? Isn't that the whole point of this whole endeavor? It's a weird time, guys. It's a weird time.
Yeah. I guess further what I want to say, though, about my stance on Batman, it's also just the writing tropes of the time lent themselves to that sort of narrative structure. And, like we said, it was a daily show that they were putting out, like, not recorded directly to wax, like that, like it wasn't live, but it was like effectively as such. So I don't know. I think it was just like the way that they had conceived of it all, like, and the fact that like we didn't have clear visions of these characters. Plus, the Shadow was already really popular, so it wasn't like there was a more popular thing on the radio that was the similar kind of archetype that I think just like kept Batman from being quite as effective here versus later when you could actually see him and have him be brooding and have like, the silhouette of Batman, which is such a cool thing. And like, you're just denied that here. Like Batman could have just been a guy with a domino mask on, and like, you wouldn't have like, there's no real point where they tell us differently in this.
Yeah, they do. I mean, they do say like he has like a bright blue hood, like a pointed hood, which is in Cape and Cowl. And it's like, wow, like it's you can't help but it's so absurd when you think about it. It's again, it is such an interesting story. I'm so happy I got to listen to it because it puts everything in context, in a really interesting context.
Lots of context, such as the fact that every single episode starts with Kellogg's Pep, this delicious cereal presents. Man, as soon as I started listening to this, and because I used to listen to this all the time, and like re-listening to it for this episode, I was like, oh right, yeah, those ads, like, oh my god, they are pernicious, like they are everywhere throughout the whole thing. And they're selling war bonds, or not war bonds, the buttons as like the bonus that are in each box of cereal, where it's like clearly they still have all this stuff left over from World War II that they're just trying to be like, no, check out our cool new sets. It's the insignia for the Marines, and this one's for the Army, and this one's the Air Force. Like,
and you can trade them with your friends.
right. Just have Mom buy PEP.
But yeah, and even to that, like, I mean, I've always known this, and like Steele's already mentioned, like this is a soap opera. Like this was a soap opera. Like it is. Actually, so it's the craziest thing is like not only was it just like it's Kellogg's Pep, and they're reminding you about Kellogg's Pep. This is something that is produced by Kellogg. They've licensed the character to tell these stories, so not to sell Superman, to sell Pep. And every time at the end of every episode, the last thing you hear, the least important thing is that it's a DC comic.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that kept on blowing me away. It's like, buy Pep, listen to the radio show, listen to the radio show, eat Pep. Also, it's in the daily, it's in the newspapers, and also there's a DC comic book. Just like
the announcer sounds so like tired and like exhausted by that point. And like it's just like, oh yeah, DC Comics publication.
By the way,
great.
This is the Mutual Broadcasting Association.
Yeah, you want to buy one of those things that'll rot your mind, kids. Yeah,
it's just like, it's so strange to hear that Superman, a comic book character, like the idea of a Superman comic book is an afterthought. I mean, it's kind of that case now, but yeah.
I mean, like, let's look at something, more recent, and probably from our childhoods, like animated cartoons in the 1980s. They were a vehicle to sell toys.
Oh, yeah.
They churned them out. Like, can you imagine putting out 65, cartoon episodes in a year now? That's mind-boggling, You can't get 5 He-Man episodes out, 10 in a row. You have to go 5 and then 5 because of the production process. And it's that there is of course there's an ulterior motive to it, but there are constraints and limitations to that as well. And so it's cool to look back at that and see some of that. At the same time, I'm not one of those people who will go back and rewatch all of the original He-Man. I liked He-Man when I was a kid. I liked Ninja Turtles too. Now that there are more modern things and my tastes have changed, things are different. But I can still appreciate what they were trying to do. I can still look back and watch like, oh my God, J. Michael Straczynski wrote that? And Paul Dini was on that? What? And you can see some sensibilities to that. J. Michael Straczynski on Real Ghostbusters. It's like, wow, okay, that's cool.
Yeah, George R. R. Martin on Beauty and the Beast, but that's completely different. Like, yeah. Because when in talking about it, like I always think about like Mighty Max, because Mighty Max was just basically to sell those like Boy Polly Pockets.
Yeah.
I don't know how well that show is, but Steele and I have talked about this a lot. Like that is one of those licenses that if I could ever get my hands on, because that is a perfect side quest here, but like my favorite thing about Mighty Max is that it's a syndicated show. And it's just going to just cycle forever. It's going to be on repeats on whatever UPN network that you're watching. and that last episode ends with a freaking time loop, so that the last episode begins with the first episode. So the next episode you watch is episode 1. I'm like, that's how you do it. That's how you goddamn do it. Sorry. I love that. I love that. And I'll fight for that show to my dying day. I don't know about I can't remember how good the entire series was, but that's a solid goddamn ending.
I mean, it had an amazing voice cast. Rob Paulson was the main character. Tony Jay was Virgil, his advisor, and Tim Curry was the main villain.
It's
Skullmaster.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like that Futurama joke about Star Trek, 79 episodes, maybe 3 dozen or so good ones. Like, it's coming from a place of loving realism. I love that show. I've seen every episode at least twice. I grew up with it. It was on my local channel, and I watched it every morning that it was on. There are good episodes, and there are episodes that are like, oh, they're good for fans. That's the way I like to put it.
Yeah. And like, to bring it back, like, this is one of those episodes, like, this story is good for fans because it's good for like, okay, like, yeah, like, just, seeing Jimmy Olsen and Dick Grayson be friends, or maybe more than friends. I know we were talking about this before we started recording, but one of my favorite aspects of this series was hearing how language evolved, specifically in the context of how we view male relationships. You have the second episode, it's like Jimmy Olsen's going to go on a date with Dick Grayson, and they're going to go swimming at the Y. And, it's these little choices that, like, in today's context, like, oh my God, are Jimmy and Dick dating? That's really exciting. That's a real, like, I'm here for this fan, and I'm down with this. Like, let's ship it. I'm shipping it right now. Like, Jimmy and Dick. Why has that never been a thing before? That's hilarious. It's like a quick layup. Like yes, of course, it's right there. Like the two best friends are dating. But.
Especially when they're presented as the same age.
Right.
Dick Grayson being allowed to grow up, but Jimmy has sometimes grown up and also reverted at times. And, he's always young, but we're never sure what young means.
Jimmy and Dick have been together a few times. You just haven't been to that corner of the internet, Adam. Venture out of your bubble a couple times.
Yeah, it was, and someone commented, because I was live tweeting it a little bit when I was listening to it. So it was such a fascinating listen. But I remember hearing that someone wrote, like, it was okay for Jimmy and Clark to, like, wake up together and have breakfast. Yep. But it was not okay for Lois and Clark to wake up together and have breakfast together, which just shows you how much things have changed.
I mean, look at I Love Lucy, 2 separate beds. They weren't even allowed to say the word pregnant. She was in the family way. That's an extreme example, but it's peppered throughout this episode. And when you're listening, once you hear one thing, you begin listening for more. And you're like, huh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or just like even how, like, Lois was portrayed in general. It's just like, I mean, look, we know that, like, how gender norms have evolved over time is a conversation that we're seeing today. But when you start seeing, like 80 years ago, how like women are just hysterical all the time, and like they can't be taken seriously. It's like, oh my God, wow. We've got a long way to go.
I would actually argue that has gotten worse, because we looked at earlier episodes in the Superman radio show, and Lois Lane was much more assertive, much more aggressive, much more like HBIC. Like, the change in this, and part of it could be argued that a good chunk of the story, she is actively kidnapped, drugged, and then in jail. So, like, we're not seeing her at her best. The only time we're really seeing her in control of her faculties and control of her situation is when she, like, gets the dumb call that, like, the bait to, like, lure her out. She says I still don't fucking understand this line.
I'll
see you in jail thing. Where it's like, who wrote that if not to be like, oh, she's about to be framed for murder?
Was it supposed to be like it was the girl pretending to be Lois or something? Was that the implication?
She's not the one who said that.
Okay.
That was Lois. Yeah, Lois.
It was Lois who said that. And she's like, jail, Clark, the place with the iron bars? Like, who makes that joke? And it's like, oh, she's probably fooling you. And I'm like, no one has that expression. That's not a thing people say. If it was dumb.
Clark brings it up later, too, when he's interrogating her in the prison. He's like, why did you say that?
Why did you say this really weird thing?
Mm-hmm. Also, Clark doesn't really come off that well either. But anyway, Steele, you were going to say.
No, well, I was just going to say,
very
but
paternalistic in this,
Yes.
but in the same sort of way, like I think this story in particular comes off that way just across the board more than some of the other stories in the Superman radio show. Like, Clark Kent is the main character in all these stories. Like, he is the investigative journalist, like figuring out everything. And he's the one talking to the police, talking to the local, like all the puzzles that are being put together are being done by Clark Kent. And then it's just for like, once he figures out where Superman needs to be, that's where Superman shows up for like brief flashes. I think that that we have this weird situation with Lois that makes her come off not as well. Behind the scenes, we're definitely going to keep listening to the sort of the next series of radio stories, because the end of this whole series is the setup for the actual real first Kryptonite story arc. It appears briefly beforehand and is established as being a weakness for Superman, but the next story is like the first time Kryptonite is actually used against him, and that whole story is an unbroken link to the Atom Man, which is like the first real Kryptonite villain that Superman actually has to deal with and fight. So we'll be checking in on Clark and seeing how he comes across and how Lois comes across. You know, like, he's dealing with a lot of like he's dealing with Jimmy and Dick, who are like kids, and he's, you know, just coming back from dealing with a bunch of dwarves. Like, it's a weird era for this whole series.
Yeah.
I don't know if I like how I said that. I'm not like, I don't
You
know
can
what
edit
the right
this.
word is here.
It's okay. No one will know. No one will know.
I think a part of this is, sorry, just want to throw something out really quick. A part of this regression comes from the Fleischer cartoons. If you read the original comics, you know, Lois is a lot more sort of, she's doing a lot more. She sometimes it's even two-handers that, you know, really these stories that are going on. And in the radio, you know, as much as I love those Fleischer cartoons, she's so much more of the classic damsel in distress that Superman has to go and rescue, because they only have, you know, they've got a reel or two in order to tell a story. Very visual storytelling, makes the stakes immediate, puts it in there, similarly to why original, you know, or early video games, and even still video games to this day, use that as a trope as well, because it's immediate visual stakes that don't require a lot of words and a lot of complex storytelling to get across for an audience that they think is mostly for younger people. So, you know, if there is that regression, I feel, in this and in other stories in this particular era. It's not quite the safety of the of the post-House investigation that's going to happen in the 1950s, where criminals always have to be punished, and, you know, it's all about the nuclear family and whatnot. But there is a little bit of this slide back here.
This is post-war. It's early in the post-war era, but the post-war era is characterized by this slide away from progressive ideals.
Right. I mean, no more women in the factories. You know, men are coming home and they're gonna provide. There is the happy days are here again. You know, women aren't asserting their rights anymore. You know, I say that as a joke, but you look at it and there's this kind of, I don't want to call it glamorized, because we're all, I wouldn't say we're all, many of us are now looking back and realize, you know, the fake veneer that's been painted over all of this media at the time. But people don't remember just like how much worry there was about atomic war and and then housing. The people were literally living in boxcars because there weren't enough houses for the returning GIs, and there was all this stuff going on, and there was this kind of need to maintain a moral order of Americana as the USSR was emerging, as America was putting its stamp onto Europe, and the quote unquote world was opening up. Post World War II colonialism, coming back and dealing with all this. There was this need to kind of stabilize, which would continue on through the 50s, until there was a radical realignment once again.
Yeah, and it is unfortunate. And like I said, we'll be checking back in to see how the story kind of like progresses with these characters, because we'll be able to see if it's just this story where it's particularly bad for Lois and Clark, or if it's more specifically just like the broader trend of the time. Because like there are some good moments in here for Lois, like when they offer to like send a car to pick her up, she's like, no, now that the gas prices are lifted or whatever, gas restrictions are lifted, like I'm driving again. And like, she wants to be like she does all the rational things. She'll drive herself. She'll have her own exit strategy kind of stuff. She offers after Jimmy is like, oh, we'll pay for dinner. She's like, we'll figure that out when we get there, because she's the adult. Like, she knows that this is ultimately going to be her kind of thing. She's still an adult in most of these scenes, but yeah, like the fact that she gets kidnapped, she's missing for a good chunk of the first half of the story, and then when she's found again, she's actively in jail being accused of murder. So I can understand her being hysterical, but it does feel that, like, I have notes that she comes off very damselly in this. It's not a particularly good look.
I was going to say, like, one thing that the other thing I really find fascinating is the fact that, like, if this is leading straight into the Kryptonite storyline that leads into the Lex Luthor storyline, that, like, it's kind of insane that these sort of big ideas, and I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this before, but it is insane that these things that we now associate so much with Superman and Batman are coming in like 6 years after the facts on radio. You know, the relationship between Superman and Batman. It's clear that Batman doesn't know that Clark Kent is Superman, which is kind of weird. But like Superman knows that Batman is Batman. But anyway, but like,
well, he's Batman, so therefore he must be Batman.
Exactly, yeah. But like, but he knows that. But he obviously knows that Dick Grayson is Robin.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
So what's interesting is just seeing that, and I think this is something that's really lost on a lot of fans now, is how much the things that we associate as always there came so much after the fact. You know, a friend of mine was talking about how he's reading all like the Batman comics, and how the like we all sort of assume like the grappling hook, right, with the pistol that he shoots out, and like that's always been there, but that really didn't come into like I believe 89 in the movie, and then it was like backfilled into the comics, but like he couldn't hold a gun, so it was for a while that he didn't have that.
Yeah, he would just like throw the batarang with the cable attached.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's like it is interesting, especially knowing that it's like, so I've always known that Lex Luthor and Jimmy Olsen came from the radio dramas, but like and Kryptonite, but to know that they all, that and his relationship with Batman all came in within this very short amount of time on a licensed media kind of boggles my mind. And you know, that could be said for basically almost any franchise. Like the things that you think were always there came after the fact in a book that you never read, you know, that you never saw or knew about. You know, as Case knows, I'm a big Star Wars fan, but like a lot of my favorite things originated in a role-playing game that Steele and I happen to play. And you know, it's like all knowing what, like, it's all comes after the fact. But again, with the Superman thing, it's just, that blows me out of the water. Yeah. That's nuts.
This was consumable media. This was, you know, you were meant to listen to it. There weren't reruns. You know, you bought a comic and you read it and you were done. And, you know, it was an example of transmedia that we now call transmedia, multimedia, because the creators were just looking to wherever they could go to get a story, to be able to pump that out. Comic book artists were doing 2 or 3 books a month. You know, now we can't even get a monthly book out for most artists because of the dedication to the craft, or, you know, because of whatever. You know, these stories needed to be put out there. And so we remember these big points because they come from this, but there are lots of ideas that didn't quite make it, you know, and you look back and you're like, wow, maybe not.
Yeah, I want to talk about one that has survived, but I think actually hit its peak in the radio series, which is Perry White. Like, he is a very strong character in this. Like, he's got like particular like quirks in his vocabulary. Like, he screws up his like analogies a lot, like his metaphors. He like reverses a lot of times. He's very passionate and invested in his reporters. Like, and he continues to be an important character in later media, but like, I don't think that there's ever been like as strong. I mean, this is such a definitive take on a character that it was backfilled into the comics, but I don't think I've seen any of the movies, any of the TV shows where Perry White has meant that much to me as a character. And it seemed like that like upper listed character in the Superman pantheon, you know, like all the movies, like he's there because he's kind of required to be there. And sometimes they do a good take on him. I'm really not trying to bash any of them. Like Superman or the 78 Superman, for example, that was recast right beforehand. So I know, because of a heart attack. So like that was kind of coming in like a little blind, like Lawrence Fishburne in Man of Steel. I think had some great uses for him in it, but like they kind of moved away from the Clark Kent secret identity, so like you don't focus that much on him. Like he had a place in Lois and Clark. He had a place in the Superman animated series in the 90s, but I don't think that any of those really like those all came from the perspective of we need to have Perry White, as opposed to no, this character must be here. I don't know. Like, did that stand out to you guys? Like.
No, I know. It's also, it's radio, so the voices have to be distinct. You can get away with a little more subtlety. There's a great moment with Frank Langella's version in Superman Returns where he like looks at the crowd and just goes, "Well, go." He just not the bombastic big Perry White that we see from Superman 78. He's like, "This is going to be the biggest interview since God talked to Moses." There has to be it's a little bigger, and that's something that we found while writing audio drama too. That not that you can't have subtlety, you can. In fact, you need to have subtlety to allow for nuance, be it morality, be it for anything that you want to discuss. But the voices have to be, I wouldn't say big, but if you have 4 people in a room and they don't sound different, it's going to get lost. Even if they are relatively differentiated, 2 women, 2 men, you can begin to lose that. And so Perry White here, has that. He's doing stuff, he's saying stuff, he is that character. And these writers who are writing this realize, if we're gonna do this, we have to differentiate the characters. And sometimes that means that they come across a little bit as caricatures, a little bit bigger, a little bit weirder than we might be used to, because they need to have those literal voices be different from everybody else. Very similar to an animated show where the character designs they have to be radically differentiated. I mean, if Matt Groening said that you can tell a good character design in an animated show if you can see them in silhouette and you know who they are. Yeah. Because you have to be able at an instant know who they are, what they're going to do, and it's the same thing in audio. When they start, and that's kind of where, unfortunately, where Lois Lane is in this series of episodes. She is the stakes, so she has to be big and hysterical, which is unfortunate because of that, but that also means you know her when you hear her, and it's clear what the situation is in a particular scene.
And to that point, what's interesting, because it's like, then when I think about how Batman and Dick Grayson are portrayed compared to Clark Kent and Jimmy Olsen, like I had trouble telling them apart. Like when Dick Grayson and Jimmy Olsen were talking to Lois in a scene, I wouldn't know who was who. I had the same issue. Same thing with Batman and Clark Kent. I'm like, I don't know who's talking, and I mean, partly that is because like they didn't have the idea of the I am Batman, they didn't have that thinking yet. But it is so curious that like they were so conscious of that in the way they wrote and designed these characters to be, easily identifiable by the way they speak and how they speak. But then you have Superman and Batman in a room together, and there's nothing really telling them apart. You have Dick Grayson and Jimmy Olsen, and they're very similar. But yeah, like it was an interesting track. The other thing that I kind of noticed, and this is more of a stylistic thing, is that because of the way that they were produced and the way that the stories were told, it's a lot of people in a room talking. Like there are entire episodes that are just 2 or 3 characters talking in a room, and then there's a surprise. That again, that's partially because of the way these things were produced. It was just a lot easier basically to have 3 people by a mic or like off mic and then doing the sound effects on the day, as opposed to what Steele and I can do, which is like have our characters running down a hallway and then out of the hallway into the middle of a street and get into a car, and then the car has planes flying overhead. Like we could do that now. It makes for a better listening experience, but that's also because we can record everything separately and cleanly, and then we could layer it all in and make our I'm going to name drop here because he's great, Josh Wilson, our amazing sound designer, go like ballistic and have hundreds of thousands of sound effects to fill the landscape, the soundscape, excuse me. Where back then they're just like, they're in water and there's a tub of water and they're just like, we can't swim, so it's interesting just hearing how what you could do in audio has changed from what they could do back then.
Yeah, and also it's an interesting point in evolution just in acting. Voice acting is a brand new profession. Most of these people are theater actors, or they were announcers, or they were vaudevillians, or they're very, very broad. And you'll see this in films too, that kind of Mid-Atlantic accent, where you're just kind of like rat-a-tat-tat. And this is a point of time where more naturalism is coming, and it has been in theater for a while, but it's only beginning to appear in other media as well, as things are shifting. And so you still have that overriding kind of stereotypical rat-a-tat-tat style, or the high and big, but you're beginning to see that. And I think that certain characters in here I felt were better than others in terms of acting. I don't think it was a bad job. I think that there is there were constraints, and I felt that it was kind of obvious what those constraints were. But I think some people dealt with it better than others.
Yeah, I want to draw attention to Bud Clayton Collier, who was the voice of Superman and Clark Kent. Like, he had a really interesting vocal delivery as having a distinct Clark Kent and Superman that would then go on to influence Kevin Conroy with Bruce Wayne and the Batman animated series. Like, he has a much softer kind of like normal speaking voice, and then goes into this much deeper, like trying to evoke power kind of voice for Superman, which you don't really get when he reprises the role for the Fleischer cartoons. Like, it's way more pronounced here than it is in those other things. Like we said, those are broader. These are areas where you actually can be a little bit more nuanced, even though like it's not nuanced either. It's a 10-minute radio show, but like the serials only were like 2 reels and like real quick.
Well, what's interesting though, it's like even then I was thinking about it just now. It's while it was really like interesting, distinct. It's like and now it's time for Superbad. Just trying to like create that visual in my head. It was because we're so used to the either like shh, or like a sort of sound effect of when he changes, or like some sort of visual cue of like he's running into a phone booth or something. But it was always really interesting in this whenever he turned into Superman in these episodes, it was just like his voice shifted, and I kept on wondering, like, is he changing in this? Is he not changing? I kind of hope that he doesn't. But like, what is that like? What does that look like? And again, that kind of comes to another sort of sense of how radio and audio drama storytelling has changed. If we were to do that in the Llama, like, where, for example, like we did make sure that our star, Gianmarco Ceresi, that when he has a Jethro Dumont voice and he has a Green Lama voice, he hated doing the Green Lama voice because it really destroyed his voice. And he did a great job of it. But, we had to sort of time that out. Either way, like if we were to do something where he actively changes costume, we would have to do some sort of sound effect to indicate that. We would do something to sort of indicate like there is a transformation, unless it's like, and there are moments in the story where he's like in the shadows out of costume, and we delineate that very clearly, where in this it's just, I'm Superman now, and the kids just accept it.
Yeah, I think also because we're reacquainting people with audio drama. I would say that, the vast majority of people who are listening to our show, when they listen to our product, when they come to it for the first time, it's one of the first times they've listened to audio drama outside of something from when they were kids, or they listened in a class one time. This is the first time they're coming to the show. And so it's kind of like we're reteaching them the way of the media. Of a medium, rather. Whereas if you're producing a show every day, there are all these shortcuts and linguistic twists and things that people just kind of accept. In the same way that some people just can't accept musicals or opera because like people just break out into song, they're singing the entire time, all this stuff is on stage, it's so ridiculous. But if you like that format, you don't think it's ridiculous. Ditto, like pro wrestling. There are things that people just accept about pro wrestling, kayfabe, the heel turn, all of these things that the outsider looks at and is like, that's absurd, or they just don't get it. But for the person who's on the inside, for the person who's listening to this serial, maybe not every day, but a lot of the days, they just, they get it and they buy it because they're involved in the form.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, this is 5 years running on the show at this point, like at 1940.
Something like that. Yeah.
Like in the earlier episodes, there was a lot of like, all right, to lock the door and out of these clothes, and now this looks like a job for Superman.
Well,
like there were more moments like that.
He kind of does that at the courthouse too. Like when was it Robin rushes in, I think.
Yeah.
And he like runs to the judge's quarters. And he's like, I have these clothes, and now it's time for Superman. And he like flies off. So I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's a good.
Yeah, so you get some of those moments, but probably at this point, every kid knows this is the shorthand.
He's doing the thing.
You know,
Yeah.
We've been listening to The Shadow for a long time. We've been listening to all these other ones for a long time. This show has been running for 5 years.
Yeah, but it's also what's been really fascinating. Like, and again, coming from sort of an audio drama producer standpoint, it is interesting reacclimating listeners to the format because there's some things that we're just so used to now when we're watching a TV show or like we're seeing a movie that you expect in the way a story is told, that back then they just didn't really need to do because, just in some ways we become more media literate and less media literate over the last few years. I think that back then people could just like kind of accept it and like go with it, whatever they were going, and just kind of be bare bones, where now people expect to see or hear more detail. Conversely, they also need more things spelled out to them in ways that, like, unless it's explicitly said this person's bad, they'll spend the entire 5 years complaining about the bad guys saying let the Jedi die, or let the past die, So it's weird. I have no idea where my point was with that. I'm just sort of frustrated.
Don't worry. I don't know where your point was either. So it's okay.
I think if I do take what you were trying to say, we're now at a point where, because we've had deconstructionist movements in this kind of like genre literature, where we have taken tropes and like really tried to break them down, or really reveled in them sometimes, like, God, I love a story that's like, how does the superpower work? And goes really into trying to have the science for it. Sometimes. And other times, no, I don't want to anywhere near there. But if this is so early on, like, there's no deconstruction of tropes. Every trope is just like face value on that one.
That's fair.
And so people are primed just to take it that kind of way. Whereas now we have to even question, like, are we going into that trope yet? We're like we're so literate that we're illiterate.
Yeah. And I think that you're making a better point than I did, because then, like, a good example is just Batman showing up at places, and like Batman in costume looking through the police archives and things like that, like, where back then it's accepted because there's no deconstruction of that idea. It's just, it is what it is, so that was Case, you said it better than I did, and I'm just gonna stop talking. Always a good idea.
I mean, look to the television show from the 60s. We kind of brought that up at the very beginning. All of these tropes are played, for kitsch at that point. It's fun, and Batman slides down a pole. Sorry, Bruce Wayne slides down a pole, and he gets to the bottom of the pole, and he's already dressed as Batman. Or he's having dinner with the mayor in full costume. They're playing it up for laughs, and then 20 years later, you have him fighting a mutant to the death in the mud, and just strangling him, and then you have a completely different take later on. We have the benefit of 80 years plus of this content, and particularly with Batman, but also Superman. Being able to kind of pick and choose our favorite kind. You can have the Batman the animated series, and then the Batman the cartoon show, and then the Batman the Brave and the Bold, and then you can have just hop from place to place, and depending upon your taste, you can tune in or tune out. I think that Batman 89, Batman Begins, the Batman are a little more similar than people try to differentiate them. But there's a lot of stuff out there that we can kind of see and look at from different perspectives, because we have all this media to act as a prism, whereas this is all happening in real time.
So we jumped into character stuff, and there's only two major ones that we haven't really spent too much time on, one of which is just Robin/Dick Grayson, who is there to be Batman's version of Jimmy Olsen. Like we were saying, this was the one that I had the hardest time telling apart from the other child in the room every single time. Like, they're just two young guys, like, they just want to go for a swim at the Y, and then he's like, someone's following me. Oh, Batman and I mean, sometimes I think about Batman so much I feel like I've been chased. Like, the majority of his plot structure is just to like hint that Batman's going to show up eventually. And then when he does, he's like there to run information back and forth between, he's a squire, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm kind of curious because you probably know more about this better. What was, based on what we know, what was like the first Batman Superman crossover like on the radio show?
I don't know very much about this one. I just, like I said, I know the name was The Mystery of the Waxmen, and I haven't listened to it, so I can't really speak to it. I know that like they reference it here because they like come across Dick Grayson, or it's like, oh yeah, he's the one that we found that thing. So whatever that story, like however that story started, because sometimes it's just like a person was on a boat and then we found them and then it took us to Borneo and like you know, like some of these stories would go real weird. So, but I can't speak to it, unfortunately.
No, because I'm just kind of curious because it's like it is. Because clearly they have a pre-established relationship, and it's clear that they've known each other for some time. But yeah, I'm kind of curious as to like how that was portrayed. But like, yeah, to your point, like Dick Grayson, I don't know, man, what a turd, what a little turd in this. Like, it's
That's
also
a cool sundial wristwatch. Batman gave it to me. I mean, not Batman.
Yeah, but not even that. It's just like I think it's interesting again. Looking at the sort of nascent experience of these stories is like what you viewed as a sidekick. What was the role of a sidekick without the benefit of like the deconstruction that we've had since that we've sort of touched on with the other characters. It is really interesting. And I think you guys already hit a nail on the head. Like they were treated as squires, and that's, you know, I never would have considered that until you guys said it.
Yeah, I think also it's, you know, I mean, these characters were created as, you know, POV characters for the young viewers. They're young. They get to hang out with Batman / Superman. You know, they're not going to have superpowers themselves, but they're gonna get to be there. And for a lot of kids, like, oh, that's so cool. You know, I wish I could do that. Compare to other sidekicks of the time, where you have Tonto from the Lone Ranger, you have Tessa Trueheart from Dick Tracy, who are a little more agented. They're doing more things. They you know, create conflict, as happens in drama. Whereas, you know, these characters, they're kind of lame, you know, from these perspectives, because they're just kind of, they're not doing much, you know, and they're just kind of whippersnappers.
I mean, yeah, they are there just
if you're taking it from the standpoint that you relate mostly to Superman or Batman, like
right,
like because that's exactly what I was going to say. They're audience surrogates, you know, like Jimmy Olsen especially. Like you feel like this is like him pleading, like Superman, you got to save Lois. Like those are the moments where it's like trying to encourage the audience to be like emotionally invested in these moments in the same way. And like for Robin is being able to participate, go get help. Okay, I'll go get help. Those are things you could imagine telling a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old or whatever, like in a situation like where there's a fire or something and like you're going to go deal with it, but like you can't do it alone. So like send the person who can't help to find help. Like though that seems like classic narrative devices that make them feel important. And like if you relate them mostly to the child, like there we go. Like that's why like Captain Marvel worked so well, because the audience surrogate is Billy Batson, who transforms into Captain Marvel, and like that, then you've got it all rolled in one. Because like even though like Captain Marvel isn't necessarily Billy, like he feels enough like it that but different enough that the child you're still relating more to. Like it's not an experience that feels alien, but you also get to live vicariously through the superhero.
Now I really want there to be a Captain Marvel radio show.
There was one at a time. He was more popular.
Well, I know that.
You know, it was.
I just wait. There's a. I know. I mean, obviously, I know about the serial.
There was those serials,
which is excellent.
I thought there was a radio show. Am I thinking of something different?
Let me find out, because I'm actually kind of curious, because like, you know, as like Steele and I have often many conversations of like, what if we had got this character? What if we got that character? You know, we did this minor little licensed character. How do we climb the ladder to get the big ones? And I was talking about this with another producer recently about like one of the biggest challenges with superhero audio dramas today is that why do I listen to a Spider-Man audio drama when I can just go see the movie? You know, why do I need to listen to, like, as much as I desperately want to do a Daredevil audio drama because he's blind. What can you do with sound, right? That would be really cool. Like, what's, you know, how do I incentivize someone to listen to that when they can just watch the Netflix show? Same thing with Wolverine. The fact that the Wolverine audio drama sucked is a completely different story. But like you know, it's like, what's it going to incentivize someone to listen to a Wolverine story when I can just watch Hugh Jackman cut people up? But
making friends and influencing people with that, you know, killer review of Wolverine.
But I think that's a general problem with the push towards these bigger budget, big media experiences. And especially now that everything is streaming and you can access it all the time. Like, it makes it harder to sell the comics because it's static images. It's making it hard. Like, it makes radio shows harder except for specific things. Like, radio shows work if you're driving because you can't watch a TV show when you're not when you're driving a car like that, or you shouldn't at least.
You shouldn't.
Yeah.
Please don't.
Well, but it's like, yeah, like an idea for like a Captain Marvel audio drama has a lot of potential because you have that idea of the young boy meet, like, and the adult. Like, there's a way of making it really enticing, you know. But yeah, like, yeah, it's weird. Like, even today, you listen, because Steele, you listened to it more than I did because I just for whatever reason could get into it. What was like the Batman audio drama that they tried to do with HBO Max, like?
So it was good. It's, once again, a lot of this stuff it's coming from people who have written for television or they've written for film. They're not really writers of audio, and that's not a disparagement. You know, they're trying to woo audiences who are used to a very particular style of storytelling. And I feel that sometimes it's the acting. You know, these actors, they're much more subtle. It's much more nuanced. It's staged, you know, theater, film acting. Whereas, you know, there does have to be a differentiation. It's the roller coaster. Your voice goes high and it comes low, and you're emoting a lot more than you might otherwise do. Very similar to an animated show, because so much of it has to come from the voice. And if you don't have that, if you don't have the writing to be able to build out the world for audiences, then, you know, it's hard because it's just kind of flat, and it's kind of an expanded audiobook. You know, the really good stuff from Big Finish, from the heavy players, Red Panda is another good one that I really like. You know, it does what it can with the form. You know, comic books, they had their time, and comics themselves, sequential art is doing really well in the form of webtoons and tapas and Comixology. But the periodical is not as strong as it once was because it was kind of I wouldn't say an abrogation of the form, but it was a very particular form for a very particular time. Ditto radio serials. Audio dramas as a form are kind of coming back, and people are rediscovering them because there's the discovery of what can an audio drama do that you can't do with anything else? What are the strengths of it, rather than, you know, I'm trying to just shove this television show into this format. And you can see that, by the way, in the early television episodes of particularly the Lone Ranger, where they're the old radio writers and they're just like saying things that you're seeing, and like, yeah, no duh, the guy is dead. I can see him there. But they're so used to this format where you have to explain everything that it leaks through. And so I think that that's a little bit of what's going on here with some of these bigger budget productions. It's great that we're getting people interested in it. It's great that we're having, you know, big time actors in it. It's cool that the form is coming back, but it's still, people are still trying to rediscover what makes the form the form.
Yeah, that makes me think about with like Marvel's What If, and people criticizing a lot of the voice actor, or rather a lot of the movie actors coming in and voicing parts on it as typically not getting it, quote unquote, like not getting the vibe of like how to be an animated voice character. But that's also the reverse, like, because that's coming from the other direction. Like this is the point where we're coming before we go into TV and so forth. And, you know, like there is a narrator, but the narrator usually is not describing too much of the actual scene. Like, usually it's conveyed by the dialogue, which works here, but would be, like you said, terrible if you could actually see what's happening. Like,
yeah, I loved when Superman had to point out to Batman that a guy was stabbed. That was my favorite part of this episode. Like, it's just like he's stabbed. Like, wait, Batman doesn't know this. It was definitely one of those, like, I understand it's the needs of the format, but also it's like, oh boy, this Batman's dumb.
It is not a smart Batman.
No, absolutely
Superman
not.
is the way better detective in this whole thing, and part of that is that he has supervision. But, like, you know,
there was also the one time where they were on the boat, and Superman sees like something hanging off of a piece of cloth, hanging off a piece of wire like 15 feet in the air, and it's like pitch black. And everyone's like, "How'd you see that?" And he's like, "Oh, I have really good."
I was looking for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also like how like he was speaking of like kind of not great at their jobs, where like Clark is like actually believes that Lois might have actually done this. He's like, well, I like there's all this circumstantial evidence. I'm like, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, buddy. Like, and you're just like sitting there like letting this trial go through, and you're just okay. And it's also like even to that point, I had difficulty. And again, because of all the stuff that we've since listened to, of not imagining a story where Superman doesn't just show up and be like, this is not okay. Like, just this idea that Clark Kent would sit there during an entire trial and be like, well, I kind of think she did because she said this jail thing that makes no sense. And like, I all this, how do you expect me to prove this? I'm like, you're fucking Superman, man. Like, do something. I get it. It's a weekly thing. It's 10 minutes long, and you need to have like a cliffhanger. But it was interesting hearing Superman be so just kind of like, well, the cops said she did it, so
oh well.
Oh well.
I mean, it is a Superman that tries to work within the system as much as he can. Like appearing as a Deus Ex Machina to solve problems occurs in this all, but like typically he tries to not involve Superman in the situation if he can help it. Like he shows up as Clark Kent to try to find Lois, like as opposed to just like trying to break through everything as Superman. Like he could intimidate the guy who owns the River of Horrors if he wanted to as Superman. Like he could do all those things, but he wants Clark Kent to handle it. He wants like there's kind of an element of the like show them the way, like have impressive people function within their society without needing that super god.
Truth, justice, the American way. Very much this character, which obviously has changed radically, not just in the last year with the change of that, but just over time, and. It's indicative of the time of the late 40s. He's working within the system. It's there, and he's also, this character is much more Clark Kent than Superman. He grew up as Clark Kent. He is not Kal-El. He is not from this race he is from Krypton. But that's not the story that we have now associated, particularly post-film, the late 70s, but also post-crisis, where there is this whole mythology around this. This kid grew up in Kansas, now he's in Metropolis. He's got these superpowers. Yeah, he's from this other planet, but that's not the format of it. He's Clark Kent first and foremost, and then he dons the visage of Superman. Whereas now we're more like, well, which is the real person? Is Clark Kent the mask or is Superman the mask? Ditto Batman. Whereas, if you talk at this time, of course it's Bruce Wayne, and he just happens to put on the mask of Batman every once in a while. Now it's
except in
once
this.
Again, yes, right, yeah. Exactly.
Except in this, he's just Batman. There is no Bruce Wayne.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that a lot when I was listening to this, like the whole who is Clark Kent the real person or Superman the real person while listening to this. And I mean, I think me as both a listener and as a writer, my tastes have sort of skewed towards, I kind of think Clark Kent is who he really is, and Superman is the mask, and whereas the inverse is with Batman. But that's me.
Yeah, despite all this conversation, we actually really haven't gotten into the plot because the plot is kind of basic. Like the majority of it all is like Lois is framed for murder because she looks like a woman who murdered someone, and there's this whole confidence gang that was like tied up with it, and they were using this like amusement park as their base of operations so that they could set this whole thing up. It's 14 episodes, and that synopsis really could have taken 3, maybe like
2,
maybe
right.
2. Like it's incredible how much that they stretch this whole thing out. Like Batman and Superman are wandering around a hall of mirrors for like 20 minutes.
So long.
2 episodes. Like they're, and that's not when they're in the River of Horrors where like Lois actually gets kidnapped. Like they're all these scenes happen a lot. I will say the series is a little ACAB. It's not it's still like leaning into starting to get into the whole like cops are always right, but like the Irish cop is not a particularly competent character. And Henderson, they shout at him quite a bit. Like he's just doing his job and he has evidence, but like they are not completely like, oh, the cops are always right, but they are a little bit effectively. Yeah, I don't know. Like the story is fine. I was like, oh yeah, it's the Batman Superman team up and it leads into Kryptonite, but it's also kind of like Batman didn't need to be here. It could have just been like another reporter. It could have been literally anyone. Like Barry White honestly could have done the job if he really needed to. And yeah, it's sort of just like, it's interesting to see the snapshot so early in the Cape Crusader's career. Like he's not defined. He's not there. Superman is way more popular and has way more personality in this whole thing and is a better detective and is more competent. Mm-hmm. In addition to being Superman, he's like on such a different scale. I don't know, but it was fun to revisit. And like I said, we'll be talking more about it, but I don't know. Closing thoughts for you guys?
I think it's a fun revisit looking at this particular period in time. There's a lot of stuff in this period that is lost to time. We talked about that first crossover that's largely gone. And it's a time capsule. And I think looking at it from that perspective, in the same way that, not everybody has to like, the classics, not everybody has to like Citizen Kane, but to understand where it stands in cinematic pantheon, and understand why it is revolutionary. I think that's important. And I think that, it's a snapshot of what these characters were like. And it's cool to see all the permutations and changes that have come since then.
I'm going to support that. I think I enjoyed this so much from both from just like an audio drama producer standpoint of learning about how the format evolved and changed within America at that time, but also just seeing how Superman and Batman evolved as characters in their nascent careers. I think it's so elucidating and puts everything into new context. I would, as I said at the top, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I really enjoyed listening to this.
J-Mike, this is your first time listening to this chunk after listening to stuff from the 40s, or from like literally 1940, and then we jump 5 years in the show. So
I love going back and listening to these things, mainly because you get to hear like the old gangster, yeah, see, we've got this guy locked up, see, yeah, and I was like, oh, this is awesome.
Oh, we haven't even talked about the jive talking like henchmen, but like, nor will we, but just like, because of the voice actor, I can't not picture him as a white guy, but I did realize on this listen that like, oh, he's probably coded as black. None of that's cool.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of problematic stuff in this, subtle and not so subtle. But once again, it's a time capsule.
Yeah, it's good to go back and listen to this stuff. And also, Batman sucks in this thing.
Terrible.
I just had to put it out there. A little salt in the wounds for all you Batman fans.
He really does suck.
He was not great in this series. That's it. That's my thoughts.
Like I said, we'll be talking more about the next couple arcs of this show because it's some really important ones. The Atom Man showed up recently in the Superman Smashes the Klan comic, which is directly based on the comics that we talked about where Superman smashed the Klan. So they're trying. They're definitely trying. This is like one of the high water marks of the era of like having some social progress and having some good stuff going on, but it's also still the mid 40s. Like, anyway, but it was really fun to like dig back into these classic radio shows and to really think about audio dramas. And I'm really glad that we had the two of you on for that, since you're actively working on those kind of material. Like, I've always been fascinated with audio stuff. I did a play in New York that was about a radio show going on. Like, I love like playing with all this stuff, but you guys are actively making those shows. So give some closing plugs.
Well, you can listen to the Green Lama and the Queens of the Sapphire Sea on basically any of your favorite podcatchers, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible. They each have their own separate shows, Green Lama with one L and Queens of the Sapphire Sea. Or you can listen to our main podcast Radio Room, which is available, again, on all podcatchers, such as Audible, Apple Podcasts. And everything, really.
If you like Batman the Animated Series, you're going to like The Green Lama. If you like Porco Rosso and Hayao Miyazaki, you're going to like Queens of the Sapphire Sea. They're both fun shows. There's a lot of episodes that you can binge your way through, particularly on a cross-country trip or if you're in a commute. Give us a shot. We're doing a lot of fun stuff. We got more episodes coming out. And you can find me on Twitter at Words of Steele, WORDSOFSTEELE.
And you can find me on Twitter at Adam Lance Garcia, also TikTok and Instagram. Though mostly it's just cats on Instagram.
J-Mike, how about you?
You can find me on Twitter at JMike101. I might have to do the Instagram thing. The cat memes they sound kind of fun.
Always trying to step up your game, your GIF game, your meme game.
I know, right?
J-Mike's a good follow. You should follow him. You should also follow the show on Twitter at Men of Steel Pod. You can follow me on Twitter at Case Aiken. You can find us at certainpov.com, where we've got more episodes of this show, tons of other shows. You can find a link to our Discord where you can interact with us directly. And yeah, next time, I have no idea what we're talking about next time, J-Mike. I cannot, we have recorded so many episodes in the last couple of weeks. My brain is turning to mush. But we will be back in 2 weeks. And until then, stay super, man.
Men of Steel is a Certain POV production. Our hosts are J. Mike Falson and Case Aiken. The show is edited by Matt Storm. Our logo is by Chris Batista. Episode art is by Case Aiken. And our theme is by Geoff Moon.
Cool. All right. So I sent you guys an outline of just to try to keep it a little bit tighter since I know, baby.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. Since as the 3-hour episode we did on Superman 3 when Adam was on last time.
Oh my God, that was 3 hours? No,
it was pretty long. I don't know
Jesus,
the exact length, but it was holy shit. It's
yeah,
we hadn't even gotten to evil Superman when all of a sudden.
Oh my God, right.
I think we cracked the hour and a half mark.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Matt, aka Stormageddon, and I'm the host of CPOV Autographs at certainpov.com. It is a bi-weekly interview series where I interview folks from all over the arts, from writers to comedians to magicians to musicians, even actors, historians, podcasters, pretty much anyone who's willing to chat with me for a little bit. If you like interesting conversations with even more interesting people, go to certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.